Hello, I'm Rob with KNN, and we are here at SEMA 2019 with an awesome guest for a special interview around Veterans Day. We got John Stryker Meyer. You might have known him from the Jocko podcast, and he wrote his book, Across the Fence, The Secret War in Vietnam. Mr. Meyer, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so not only with a Veterans Day, we got to get into your book, but first, you definitely have a tie to motorsports and cars. Could you tell us about a specific vehicle?
And we're at SEMA 2019 in Lost Wages.
Absolutely, Lost Wages.
Yeah, so what more could a man ask for? So
That's
we're here. So basically, in between my tours of duty in Vietnam, when we came home, everybody had pocket money. So in my case, I bought a 442 W30, and it was a 1969 Oldsmobile, for those who may forget.
Of course.
An Oldsmobile 442, and they had a W30, a 31, and a 32.
Mm-hmm.
But the W30 was the heavyweight.
Gotcha.
It had the big, I think it was a 455, 4-speed, and I was king of the road.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah, so we loved it.
That's awesome.
So I had it only for a few months, because then the insurance costs went up. And by that time, the pocket money from my poker games that I invested in the 442, they weren't sufficient for the insurance, because even then, the insurance was high.
Yeah.
This is 1969.
Not
so
much
I'm up
has
at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and it was a great car. We had a few races along the way on Highway 2.
Okay.
Never lost. And one night we were coming home on a weekend. We stopped by Garrison, New York, to see Johnny McIntyre, who I went over with. We had gone through training group. He got injured, came home early. So we saw him. I was driving to my folks' house down in Trenton, New Jersey. So it was me and 4 of my buddies. We're in the car. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're on the New Jersey Turnpike heading to Trenton, get off at exit 7. And about 130 miles an hour, and I hear a noise. And Tony Harrell's he's riding shotgun with me. I said, Tony, what's that noise? He said,
good.
I think he just blew your engine.
Oh, man.
So we blew it up at 130 miles an hour. But we pulled over, called my dad. He came out, towed us back. It was covered by warranty. But that was my brief period of fame and glory.
Oh, well, covered by warranty. That sounds incredibly lucky.
Oh, very lucky. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That was probably music to your ears when you got in there and they said, we'll take care of it. And you went, whew.
Oh, yeah. So then when the insurance had to go back to a more humble F-85, and I was so embarrassed driving that around, I said, I'm going back to Vietnam. I don't want to be seen in this car.
Yeah.
Not when I'm in uniform.
Too embarrassing, huh?
Yeah. But you know, several of our guys, when they came back, Don Wolken, who was on the front cover of Across the Fence, he was our team leader for that mission. Mm-hmm. He had a Z28, the yellow with the big black stripes down the hood.
Oh, yeah.
And Spider Parks had a Oldsmobile 89. Cool. A couple other guys had GTOs, and John Walton went out and bought his own motorcycle, traveled across the USA on his Triumph.
That's awesome.
That's what he said. He said, when we're in Vietnam, this year's done. The money, he made a lot of money playing poker. Mm-hmm. So when I go back to the United States, I want to get a motorcycle and just travel across country and check it out. And he did.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That is way cool. Now, you talked about some of your buddies in SOG. For those who don't know what SOG is,
yes.
Would you explain to them what your role was in Vietnam and tell them a little bit of the background of the Secret War?
Sure. During the Vietnam War from 64 to 72, there was an 8-year secret war. Our government had entered into a, I don't want to say a contract, but there was an agreement with Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam. Of course, North Vietnam was the enemy. Mm-hmm. South Vietnam are our allies in the South. And we entered this agreement where we said we'd have no armed troops in Laos or Cambodia, which is right next to Vietnam. And the communists, being the honorable people they are, decided the same thing. Or they agreed to it in public, of course. Well, when they agreed to it in 62, they had been coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for several years already. Oh, yeah. Putting in troops, supplies. So the Secret War was Green Berets going in with recon teams, sometimes a hatchet force, across the fence into Laos or Cambodia, occasionally into North Vietnam for downed pilots. Mm-hmm. And those were our missions. As it turned out, it was the highest casualty rating during the war, because we exceeded 100% casualties.
I believe it.
Men were either killed in action, missing in action, or wounded. And some of our guys had 8 Purple Hearts.
Wow.
So that's why it exceeded that. And so the missions would be to go across the fence to see what they're doing, what the enemy was doing for troop movement, supplies. Sometimes be a point mission to go to a fuel line to blow it up. Go in for a wiretap, because the NVA telephones, the ones in Laos, when you hung up the phone in the cradle, the wire was still alive.
Okay.
So we always carried a cassette recorder with a wire, and Sal, my Vietnamese counterpart,
Right.
could climb up the telephone pole, tap into the enemy phone, and he would come down. He'd put mud on the wire, so if anybody walking by, they wouldn't see it.
Right.
And then we record the phone, even you couldn't hear anything on it, turn it into the CIA, and they'd amplify it 100 times.
Wild.
Then they could hear what the enemy was saying. They got good intel for that, they said. And so then a live POW, capture a POW.
Right.
Those are most of the other missions. And then we also had, the Air Force came up with sensors. We had like a 3-unit sensor, which would have a center unit with a coaxial cables that are like 20 feet long.
Right.
You go in and put them in next to a trail that was being used on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Right.
Put it in, bury everything, so the only thing up would be antennas. Anything going by would monitor it, and then give reports to the Air Force.
Hey, you talked briefly about your first couple missions, I believe, were setting those down, and you were almost surprised that you didn't, in those first couple missions, see any NVA resistance, but then you remembered what they had told you during training is that the NVA fights when and where he wants to.
True.
Right?
That's guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
just wild. So when you first got to SOG, you were in the Aisha Valley, right? That's where most of your missions were?
Yes.
FOB4?
Well, I was out of, I first landed at FOB1 in May of '68.
Okay.
And that's when I got off the helicopter and a recon team went on. It was the code name Spike Team Idaho.
Right.
And Glenn Lane and Robert Owen were the Americans with 4 indigenous troops, and they remain missing in action today.
Wow.
They
Yeah,
got wiped out. Then the bright light went in 2 days later.
Right. I was wanting to. Your first. You weren't even in there for 24 hours.
Well, we got into camp and they took off for the mission.
Right.
So, and then by that night, the camp was worried because they
Hadn't
hadn't
heard
made
back from
no
them.
commo.
Right.
And then they sent a bright light in either the next day or 2 days later. And then everybody in the bright light was wounded. One of their team members was killed in action.
Yeah.
And that's where they were in a bomb crater. And they got hit with American weapons.
Right.
And American hand grenade. And so one of the guys, George Sternberg, literally had his jungle boots blown off by an American hand grenade.
Right.
So they had a lot of shrapnel.
Yeah. That must have been a harrowing. Just you're out there looking for this Spike team that went missing, and then you're being engaged by what's probably their firearms and their grenades. I mean, that must have been.
Oh yeah.
Heavy, man.
They came back, and we always talked about every mission amongst the recon guys to try to learn from it, to see how we could better perform the next time in the field or try to get any kind of a tactical advantage. In that case, it was just bad news all around.
Right.
The guys appeared to be wiped out. They had our weapons and hand grenades because our hand grenades were far superior to what they had.
Right.
The Chi-Com grenades.
Yeah, you mentioned that several times. They're Chinese grenades.
Yes.
And there's a lot of times when they were just throwing them in a sack, basically, and just throwing them into this crater at these guys, and a lot of them aren't going off, and they're just lucking out.
Right.
Right. That's they must not have been very trustworthy. I mean, that's
no, indeed.
Yeah.
So that was the introduction to the Secret War. I'd gone through a year plus training with several of the other guys, and then we were there. We had volunteered for when you come through in-country training, at the end they say, there's a project. Do you want to volunteer? So me and Johnny McIntyre and a few other guys, we said, sure, we're in.
Absolutely.
The movie The Green Berets was out with John Wayne at the time. And so it's like, what would the Duke do? The Duke would go.
100%.
So we're there.
Yeah. So what was going through your mind as you guys are listening to the communications between that bright light that went in to look for Spike Team Idaho?
Yeah.
And that was Spike Team Oregon that went in, right, on the
Correct.
bright light?
Yeah.
What was going through your mind? Your first day there, it's probably dead silent. People are stressing out because they're trying to get a grasp of the situation. They're hearing this intense firefight. This is your first day there. What was going through your head?
It was like, oh shit, we're not going to see Christmas.
Yeah.
And this was May of '68. And so after we'd been there a few days, we had learned about several other recon teams that had been wiped out earlier that year or were missing in action. And we had another team where everybody was wiped out except for the team leader. And he escaped and evaded for 3 days. And then they finally saw somebody, a helicopter pilot, somebody saw him and picked him up and brought him back.
Wow. So
Yeah.
they somehow, he was able to flag him
John
down.
Allen.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's wild.
It was.
I mean, I could only imagine what he was thinking. Just, what are the odds of him being spotted and being able to get picked up? I mean, that's...
Yeah, just one of those everyday miracles. You know, it's kind of like just another day in SOG. You never know what's going to happen.
Right, right. And you mentioned in your book Lynn Black. And there's a story about his spike team going in, and they encountered severe NVA resistance. As he's flying in, he notices a flag.
Right.
And so
NVA
Intel,
flag.
yes, an
In
NVA
Laos.
flag in Laos. And Intel and history and his knowledge and his experience told him there were probably around 3,000 NVA troops there. So they know they were going up against a superior force.
Right.
Well,
And so our missions were usually recon. We weren't sent in to be like the Marine Corps
Right.
or the Rangers. Here, there's a unit, go attack them and kill them all.
Right.
Our job was to go in behind enemy lines and then to avoid contact. But if we had to fight, we would fight
100%.
for survival.
Right.
So in Lynn's case, the team leader had no experience. And Lynn had had a year prior in Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne.
Right.
So when the first helicopter went in with the team leader, and he didn't pay any attention to the flag. Well, Lynn went in on the second helicopter, and by now they were getting shot at. So Lynn, from common sense alone and his experience, said, we got to get out of here. There's at least 3,000 people here.
Right.
And the team leader goes, no, they're not going to run me out of here.
Right.
In fact, go down this trail. And they had, the Vietnamese on the team were not happy about it.
Right.
Lynn wasn't happy. And the assistant team leader, it was his first time on the ground in Laos. So it was his first combat or time across the fence.
Right.
So he had two inexperienced and Lynn Black. So the team leader takes them down a trail. And they go down a trail, and in front there's like a rise, like an L shape. Well, up there, the NVA colonel heard the helicopter coming, put 50 enemy soldiers up there,
Sheesh.
and he walked them into an ambush. The point man was killed instantly.
Right.
The team leader was killed instantly. And that began a day-long siege with the remaining 7 men, one of whom died later on that mission.
The story is just unreal.
It is. It's one of the SOG legend stories.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because at one point, they're in a crater. Him and Cowboy,
Right.
the indigenous guy that was attached to his team, his indigenous teammate, and they are pulling and stacking bodies,
dead enemy
bodies,
soldiers.
yeah, to use as almost like sandbags.
Like a bulwark. Yeah.
Unreal, yeah, and low on ammo. I was
Yeah.
reading that and I couldn't you couldn't make this up. If I saw a movie on some of these stories, I would say no way. Like this
Oh,
is
yeah.
so far fetched. How did anybody survive this?
Well, because I was in camp and we could hear some of the radio transmissions from Covey, the FAC,
Right.
the forward air controller who controls the other TAC air. And you could hear what they're saying, and then they came back and refilled. This thing went on all day long.
Right.
And at one point where they had the bodies stacked up, it was just amazing to think that there are so many people coming way at the way. They kept killing them. Then they finally got some airstrikes going in. And at one point, a helicopter gunship came in
Right.
front of the team and mowed down a frontal wave attack.
Right.
Then he pulled out.
See, I actually highlighted that because I want to read this out to anybody.
sure.
Yeah, it's the judge and the executioner were the call signs of these guys, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. So it says, at the last moment, with the NVA a few body lengths away from the perimeter, 2 Huey gunships from the American Division, 176th Aviation Company, the Minutemen muskets of 36C arrived. The UH-1B pilots, codenamed the Judge and the Executioner, they roared into battle, first with a minigun blast, followed seconds later with several 2.75 millimeter rockets placed in the NVA ranks. Alabama was saved only for a little while. The NVA backed off for a few moments, briefly licking their collective wounds, although they were far from whipped. New assault lines of NVA troops formed. Before the NVA opened fire on ST Alabama, however, the Executioner confronted the NVA head-on with both door gunners blazing away with their handheld M60 machine guns. He hovered inches off the ground between the team and in the front of the NVA and skipped several rockets off the ground into the NVA. That is insane. Like, I just, when I was reading this, I was blown away. Like, this is unreal. Unreal.
Yeah.
Those pilots were absolute studs.
Absolutely. And, you know, the judge, he had one other legendary mission where a recon team had moved at night and they came under a cliff. They didn't realize the cliff was an enemy anti-aircraft position. So they made contact, and so any of our aircraft that would try to come in to support them couldn't, because they had anti-aircraft shooting at them.
Right.
And they made several runs at it with fast movers and A-1 Sky Raiders, but because the team was underneath it, they had to be careful. They couldn't use napalm or CBU. And so the judge, he was behind it. He flew around over the top, did a 180, went back and blew him out.
Wild.
Yeah. So that was the judge. Just another day flying support for SOG.
No kidding, right?
Yeah.
And towards the end of that mission, that engagement, Black actually, his team's going to the chopper, and this blew me away. There were two of the NVA soldiers who told him to give up.
Yeah,
told him
Chu Hoi.
surrender, and he said, Chu Hoi, and they were like kind of puzzled, but he walked right up to him, grabbed one by the barrel, punched him in the face, and then swung the rifle around and took out the other guy.
Cold cocked the other one, yeah. And the barrels were hot because they had been firing at the helicopter, so he burned his hands. And then he gets lifted out on the hoist, and they pull him in, and as the helicopter's finally going up, he could feel the helicopter get these lift because they're hitting it with B-40 anti-personnel rockets.
Wild. And it was so heavily armored, it was kind of helping him almost.
It gave him a little lift, him. But all the other shrapnel wounds and everything, the helicopter was able to get over a couple hills, a couple mountains, and then it had to do an emergency landing. Another helicopter came and picked up part of the team, and then Lynn and the 1-1, the assistant team leader, then got a ride with a Cobra gunship. And the Cobra gunship has like these ammo racks.
Right.
They come down and they can tie you in.
Right.
And they flew them back.
Wild.
And so we lost the Jolly Green Giant, a King Bee, several other aircraft got shot up really bad. And that night, when Lynn went back, he went back with the Jolly Green Air Force men. And you saw the motto of the Jolly Green Giants, that others may live. And that's where it really came home, because they had the Jolly Green that crashed, 2 were killed, and they were able to recover the pilot and one of his door gunners from that. And that was part of at the end of the day, after all the firefights and everything, Lynn was able to go out, find them, bring them back, and get to the helicopter and get those that were left alive out. And then one of his team members, he knew he was too severely wounded.
Right.
So he was there with his 45.
Right. Yeah, I read about that part. That was heavy. There's a great part of that also to wrap up that story. A few decades later, Lynn Black actually got a phone call from the NVA leader who was there that day, and
who ambushed the team.
Yes, and it says Black said he and the NVA general chatted for a few more minutes about the events before Black mentioned that the NVA had inflicted heavy casualties on Spike Team Alabama, killing 3 team members and wounding 5 of the remaining 6. The NVA general told me that his unit had suffered 90% casualties that day. He then told the general when he observed the flag flying in the middle of the knoll, he assumed that the intelligence estimates of an NVA battalion of approximately 3,000 troops was accurate. The general's response ensured their place in SOG history, like you said. No, the general corrected Black. It was a division. We had about 10,000 soldiers of the Army of North Vietnam there that day. Wow.
And then what's the kicker? The general told him, "You shot me 3 times."
That's right. And he said the worst thing about that was he couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, because I interviewed, when it went down, we talked a little bit about that day with Lynn.
Right.
And afterwards, because that one team member there were some issues that had to be dealt with. So I went back and interviewed him like 20, 25 years later for the book. And that's when I learned these details. And we had the phone call from the general, and Lynn says, yeah, when we were in the middle of that firefight, the ridge was up with the enemy soldiers, and Lynn was shooting him a single shot.
Right.
Because he didn't want to waste any bullets.
Right. Precious ammo.
Yeah, so he reloaded and he says, I was shooting. I remember some people spun around. I had to shoot him 2 or 3 times. Well, one was the colonel.
Unreal.
Who set up the ambush. They ambushed his team, and then they talked. And he says, yeah, you inflicted 90% casualties.
Unreal.
And you shot me 3 times.
3 times.
That's one of those
heavy
stories. And it got straight from the enemy himself.
Yeah, straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
Wow. So before we wrap this up, your book is titled The Secret War in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I've had the pleasure of having some close friends who have fought in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and a lot of them have had a hard time transitioning back to civilian life and are having a hard time. There's another secret war they're fighting. Your transition from back to civilian life, do you have any advice for them? Anyone that might be struggling? Because it's a shame, we lose 22 veterans a day to suicide, and loads more are struggling. From someone who's been there, do you have any advice for them? Any words of wisdom? Anything that they can utilize?
Well, in our case, is to stay in touch with your buddies, your combat buddies, and try to stay in touch on a daily basis. And in my case, I went back to Trenton, went back to school, and so made some new friends. But I had old friends where kind of went back into where I grew up.
Right.
So I had the church, and everybody there was kind of like, well, he's a Vietnam vet, but what do you say? And everybody's polite. And in our case, we had a lot of people that we lost. But, you just, like, our people told us, in the firefight, it's you versus them. And if you want to go home, and when you do get home, now don't be afraid to talk to people. And that's the key thing. I mean, I think some of the suicide things that happen today, they're unpredictable because you don't know what they're up against or what they're really thinking.
Right.
And by talking to the guys with a dialogue, particularly the young men today, and the young women that are coming out, because they're both seeing combat. Even if you think about convoy duty, if they're transporting and driving stuff, you think that's not serious combat. You're not like the Marine Corps going in and attacking the enemy headquarters.
That's very serious, yeah.
But it's very serious
Right.
because that's what they're going to attack.
Right.
It's guerrilla warfare, and then with the IEDs, it really gives an additional lethality to it,
Right.
as well as an uncertainty. You never know when you're going to be hit.
Yeah.
And the key thing is communications.
Just staying in touch. Yeah, it was wow, because my buddies fought in the Battle of Ramadi, and they were with the 3-8 Marines. One of them told me, because I would just listen,
Yeah.
I don't have anything to bring in that conversation, but he told me that, because unfortunately there's a culture of, if they weren't there, they don't understand, so don't talk about it. But me, he was a good buddy of mine, so I just listened, and he told me, the reason I tell you this, and people might get upset and say he wasn't there, he doesn't get it. So the reason I tell you this, and it kind of reminds me of the people that were encouraging me to write these books. He says, if we don't tell anybody, they don't know our sacrifice. They don't know what we went through.
Oh yeah, indeed.
And so people should know. And it was an honor that, some of those guys
Yeah,
used me as a
because
soundboard.
with our secret war, we had signed documents saying we won't talk about it.
Right.
And like the helicopter pilots that came in, they were told, you can't talk about this for 20 years also. Some had to sign, like the pilots, the officers actually had to sign documents that were similar to that.
Wow.
So in my case, I was there for a year, came home in April, at the end of April, went to Fort Devens for 5 months with the 10th Group, then went to the Pentagon, got orders cut to go back, and I got back on the recon team with Lynn. And when we went back, in fact, it was November 3rd, 1969, where I've been back for a little over a week, and we had RT Maryland that got wiped out.
Wow.
So it's like deja vu. We're back in the groove, and then 10 days later, RT Oregon got wiped out.
Right.
And that was where with Maryland, all the Americans were killed, but the indigenous troops escaped. So you always have like a psychological thing that has an impact on the camp.
Absolutely.
And those are the kind of things that stick with you, but you still got to get up in the morning and go do the job. And then for Veterans Day, the only other thing is from the Vietnam veterans perspective, is we have 1,587 Americans missing today in Southeast Asia from the Vietnam War.
Right.
And in Laos alone, we have 50 Green Berets that fought in the Secret War, plus approximately 120, 125 airmen, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, that died supporting those Green Berets on the ground in the secret mission,
Wow.
in the Secret War. And they're still missing in action. And we have the DOD has the Department of POW MIA accounting agency. To this day, right now, they have teams that are in the field going through, sifting it, because the jungle floor grows.
Right.
So if they have a site, they have to go through, dig to a certain level, then go through all the soil, sift it, separate things, look for any remains, anything from a tooth
Right.
or a finger bone.
Wow.
And the acidic soil is so,
corrosive.
yes, it literally destroys everything, including the bones.
It's wild.
So we're up against a time factor
Thing too. Time
there.
in nature.
So that's where, for Veterans Day, it's I like to keep in mind the men and women that didn't come home.
100%.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's really been an honor to have you for this Veterans Day
Well, thank
coming up, and just this awesome stories that you have, and we really appreciate having you.
Pleasure to be here and to keep up the good work.
Absolutely, sir.
Keep the filters rolling.
Thanks. Yeah, you too. Keep telling the story. People
We
need
will.
to hear it.